again. I'm so pleased to have this chance to visit with you folks, and I hope that you feel we can have a very relaxed session this evening, and I would be glad for any questions that you might have, and anything that you might share. And I just hope that I don't go on too long. I'm very aware that it seems like the shorter my speeches are, the more people appreciate them. We'll be talking about the highlights of the Gettysburg era from June through December of the year 1863, and I think you're all aware that's actually well into the second year of this horrible war. Actually, we're into the third year, aren't we? We're past the second year. Well, June the 15th was when the Confederate troops are pouring across the Potomac River into Maryland. The rebel cavalry is reported in Pennsylvania. Some 130 miles exist from the head of General Lee's line in Pennsylvania to the tail of that line at Fredericksburg. More than 100,000 Union troops are now on the move, staying between Lee's army and Washington City. Great anxiety exists throughout the North. The Pennsylvania governor has called up 75,000 militia. June the 20th, West Virginia has seceded from Virginia and today became the 35th state of the Union. Welcome, West Virginia. June the 27th, as General Lee's army marched north into Pennsylvania, panic spread through the region. On this date, I replaced fighting General Joe Hooker with General George Gordon Meade as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Potomac. General Meade's hot temper earned him the nickname the Old Snapping Turtle. As it turned out, that would come just 3 days before the battles there at Gettysburg. June the 28th, in tattered, nondescript uniforms, some without shoes even, the long gray columns of General Lee's army had been passing through Chambersburg. In contrast to their ragged clothes is their high spirit and polished weapons. There have been several clashes between Confederate Jim Stuart's cavalry and the Union cavalry. June the 30th, approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, Union General Buford's cavalry division entered Gettysburg. The troopers found the townsfolk were wildly excited about the sudden approach and withdrawal just a few minutes before of a Confederate infantry brigade. That force was under Brigadier General Pettigrew. Three descendants of African civilians there at Gettysburg were greatly concerned, and many of them left town or went into hiding. Many were kidnapped by the Confederate soldiers and sent south and sold into slavery. And that wasn't a horrible thing. Well, July the 1st, Gettysburg, and I'm just touching on some of these major things. I trust that you are familiar with them. This is when the Confederate troops under General A.P. Hill were en route to town, and they ran into the Yankees under General Reynolds just west and north of town. Vicious fighting took place and General Reynolds was killed. After Confederate General Early's division arrived, the Union Army was outflanked and broke, streaming through the streets of Gettysburg, losing 4,000 men killed and captured. The Federal line crumbled and fell back more than a mile to Cemetery Ridge below town. And can you begin to imagine what it would be living there in Gettysburg and having these soldiers running down through the streets and shooting at each other? And just, I cannot begin to imagine how horrible that would be. Well, again, I'm just touching on some of these events. July the 2nd, there at Gettysburg, was some of the most vicious and bloody fighting of the war occurred in the peach orchard and the wheat field, which was covered with the dead as the Confederates drove toward a rocky hill called Little Round Top. Rebel troops surged to the crest of the hill only to be driven back in hand-to-hand fighting. The army that controls the high ground on the battlefield has great advantages. It can see what the enemy is doing. It can use its artillery effectively, and its position is easier to defend. At Gettysburg, Union forces just barely beat the Confederate forces to the top of a round top, a hill at the extreme southern end of the Union line. The Union forces took defensive positions, piling up rocks and making breastworks, and under the command of Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, held off numerous Confederate attacks. They were virtually out of ammunition, and the Confederates were about to attack again. Colonel Chamberlain ordered that when the Confederate troops charged up the hill again, the Union soldiers were to get up from their defensive positions at the hilltop and charge downhill in a line toward the Confederate troops, yelling for all they were worth. They did. Their bold action stopped the Confederate charge and resulted in the capture of Confederate soldiers. Little did those rebels know that many of the Union soldiers who held them at gunpoint had no bullets in their weapons. There also was vicious fighting to the Union right at the north end of the battle line at Culp's Hill on that day. A couple of other incidental things on July the 2nd. Again, this is the second day at Gettysburg. While returning the 3 miles back to the White House from our cottage there at Soldier's Home, Mary's carriage crashed, perhaps as a result of sabotage. She was thrown from the carriage and hit her head on a rock, cutting her badly. Our son would say that she was never the same after that accident. Another happening on July the 2nd, only one civilian was killed during the battle which raged in and around Gettysburg. Miss Virginia Wade, you may know better as Jennie Wade, was killed in her home when a sniper's bullet came into the kitchen while she was baking bread for the soldiers. It was so sad and ironic that Jennie's fiance, Corporal Jack Skelly, a Union soldier, was killed at about the same time in the Battle of Winchester. Neither of them knew that the other had died. They had planned to be married as soon as possible. And so many sad stories. I think it was a miracle that only one civilian was killed during those 3 days. Well, now to the third day, July the 3rd, following a lull in the battle, at 1 o'clock the Confederate artillery opened fire on the center of the Union line with 159 guns. More than 170 Union batteries along Cemetery Ridge soon answered for the greatest artillery duel in history, and that does total up to 329 guns. The earth shook, as you can imagine perhaps. Then 15,000 rebels, including General Pickett's division, stepped out in a lineup across a mile of open fields. The Union batteries tore gaping holes in their lines. When the Confederates were 200 yards from the Federal front, the rebels charged. At a stone wall near the center of the line, desperate hand-to-hand fighting occurred. Many of Pickett's troops surged over the wall and came close to succeeding, but they were repulsed by the Yankees. Where their attack stalled on that low-angle slope has been called the high water mark of the Confederacy. And the rebels slowly retreated. Less than 7,000 returned after the charge from 15,000 that started. And I have heard from a very good source that our Union Army were, let's just say, bawling their eyes out, laying there firing at those poor Confederates coming across this field towards them. Well, another happening on July the 3rd, another battle raged 3 miles east of Cemetery Ridge when General Jeff Stuart and his rebel cavalry were stopped on their way to charge the backside of the Union line. The Union cavalry under General George Custer led this attack. And General Custer, I trust you're all aware, another one of our wonderful Ohio generals. Well, July the 3rd, the casualty figures indicate more than 23,000 Union troops have fallen, with Confederate losses of 28,000 for the 3 days, and that totals 51,000. More than 4,500 horses have been killed during the battle. And heavy rains made it impossible for General Lee to beat a hasty retreat back into Virginia. But due to his army being exhausted, General Meade delayed before pursuing Lee. Thus the Union missed yet another chance to destroy Lee's army. And another sad story, maybe you'd rather not hear with this horrible rains that they had. Many of the basements there in Gettysburg were flooded, including in the cemetery building. And many of the wounded soldiers had been taken laying on the floor in the basement of the cemetery building. And the water came up. And those poor fellows that couldn't get up, couldn't move away, they ended up drowning. And again, there's sad stories. Well, now we're at July 4th, Independence Day. I did pass up any patriotic ceremonies in Washington City. I did announce a brief statement that the news from the Army of the Potomac is such as to cover that army with the brightest honor, to promise a great success to the cause of the Union, and to claim the condolence of all for the many gallant fallen, and that for this I especially desire on this day, he whose will, not ours, should ever be done, everywhere remembered and reverenced with profoundest gratification. Well, on July the 4th, General John Pemberton surrendered at Vicksburg, Tennessee, on the Mississippi River there to General Grant. Something like 30,000 Confederate troops marched out of the city and stacked their arms inside the Union lines. General Grant has taken 172 cannon and 60,000 muskets. Vicksburg was important because Confederate guns on the bluffs above the river could shell any passing ships, effectively closing the river. Well, finally, the news regarding Vicksburg's surrender reached us in Washington City on July the 7th, or 3 days later. And that word spread quickly through the streets, taverns, and hotels in Washington City. Crowds gathered, and a military parade was formed to march to the White House. It was a joyous occasion, and the sun went down that day in glory on the universal idea that the Union was saved. That war had gone on for over 2 years. These dual victories at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and Vicksburg in Mississippi made it highly unlikely that England or other European nations would formally recognize the Confederacy. Well, at 8 o'clock that evening, July the 7th, I was compelled to respond to the hundreds of citizens that had assembled in front of the executive mansion. I spoke from the window of the portico to the crowd using these words: "Fellow citizens, I am very glad to see you tonight, but yet I will not say thank you for this call, but I most sincerely thank Almighty God for the occasion on which you have called. How long ago is it? 80-odd years since, upon the 4th day of July, for the first time in the world, a Union body of representatives was assembled to declare as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. That was the birthday of the United States of America. Since then, the 4th of July has had several very peculiar recognitions. The two most distinguished men who framed and supported that paper, including the particular declaration I have mentioned already, these gentlemen, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the one having framed it and the other sustained it most ably in debate. The only two of the 55 or 56 who signed it, I believe, whoever were president of the United States, well, just precisely 50 years after they put their hands to that paper, it pleased the Almighty God to take away from the stage of action on the 4th of July. And let me mention, these two gentlemen died the same day, 4th of July of 1825. This extraordinary coincidence we can understand to be a dispensation of the almighty ruler of events. Well, another of our presidents, James Monroe, 5 years after these gentlemen died, in the year of 1831, was called from the stage of existence on this same day of the month, and now on this 4th of July just passed, when a gigantic rebellion has risen in the land, precisely at the bottom of which is an effort to overthrow that principle that all men are created equal. We have a surrender of one of our most powerful positions and powerful armies forced upon them on that very day. And I see in the succession of battles in Pennsylvania, which continued 3 days so rapidly following each other, as to be justly called one great battle, fought on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of July, and on the 4th, the enemies of the declaration that all men are created equal had to turn tail and run. Gentlemen, this is a glorious theme and a glorious occasion for a speech, but I am not prepared to make one worthy of the theme and worthy of the occasion. I would like to speak in all praise that is due to the many brave officers and soldiers who have fought in the cause of the Union and liberties of the country from the beginning of this war, not on occasions of success, but upon the more trying occasions of the one of success. I say I would like to speak in praise of these men, particularizing their deeds, but I am unprepared. I should dislike to mention the name of a single officer, lest in doing so I wrong some other whose name may not occur to me. Recent events bring up certain names gallantly prominent, but I do not want to particularly name them at the expense of others who are as justly entitled to our gratitude as they. I therefore do not, upon this occasion, name a single man, and now I have said about as much as I ought to say in this impromptu manner. And if you please, members of the band, I'll take the music. And I might say I really do not care to deliver impromptu speeches, especially I do not want to say anything that would come across as being foolish. So I much preferred preparing all of my speeches. Well, we're now July 9th. Fort Hudson, Louisiana surrendered 5 days later. This is 5 days after Vicksburg fell, that the Union controlled the entire Mississippi River, and moreover, the Confederacy was effectively split in two, east to west. I said that now the Father of Waters flows unvexed to the sea. Well, back to July 7th, General Lee's defeated Gettysburg and forced him and his army to head back south again. It was good news for the Union, of course, as with General Grant's capture of Vicksburg on the Mississippi. But as historian Bruce Catton writes, and I'm quoting Mr. Catton, the president was in no mood to rejoice over the recovery of lost territory. He wanted Confederate armies wiped out. In light of those two victories, Lincoln had said, now General Meade can complete his work so gloriously prosecuted thus far by the literal or substantial destruction of Lee's army, the rebellion will be over. Mr. Patton continued, again using his words, the president's feeling of frustration began when he read a congratulatory order that General Meade issued after Gettysburg, inviting the army to keep up the good work and to drive the invader from our soil. To my secretary, Johnny Hay, I exploded angrily. Will our generals never get that idea out of their heads? The whole country is our soil. The Union was endangered not because of Lee's army was in Pennsylvania, but because Lee's army existed at all. Well, as Lee did go back to the Potomac, General Meade cautiously followed. I grew more impatient, and when newspaper man Noel Brooks left to visit Meade's headquarters, I confessed my fear that something would happen to save Lee's army from annihilation. Well, July the 14th, news came that Lee's army had indeed escaped, crossing the Potomac at night on an improvised pontoon bridge and returning to Virginia bruised but alive. And I said we had them within our grasp. We had only to stretch forth our hands and they were ours. I composed a letter to General George Meade in which I expressed profound disappointment in his inability to pursue and destroy Robert Lee's army. I did not send that letter, and I found writing such correspondence and then storing it away was a favorite coping mechanism of mine. And that's a fairly lengthy letter, and I'll not take your time now to read this. But, okay, we're July 25th now, 3 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg. David Wills, a local banker and civic leader, wrote Pennsylvania's Governor Andrew Curtin and described what he saw when he visited the battlefield, and you may not like to hear this. He wrote, "Our dead are lying on the fields unburied, that is, no grave being dug, with small portions of earth dug up alongside of the body and thrown over it. In many instances, arms and legs, and sometimes heads protrude, and my attention has been directed to several places where hogs were actually rooting out the bodies and devouring them." And I would rather not have read that. Perhaps I should not have. But can you imagine? There is a civilian in Gettysburg, and the horrible stench of those decaying bodies. Okay, we're now July 26th. 23-year-old Cornelia Hancock wrote to her mother in New Jersey from the field hospital 5 miles from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. "My dear mother, it is now about 5 o'clock in the morning. Our hospital has been moved and our stores have given out. The field hospitals were closed at the end of July, and the wounded men who were still too critical to be evacuated were transferred to the General Hospital established in Gettysburg. There is nothing to cook with. We have to see our wounded men fed with dry bread and poor coffee, and I can tell you it is hard to witness some cursing for food, some praying for it. I would give anything to have a barrel of butter and some dried rusk. And rusk is a hard biscuit or twice-baked bread that I have seen in our parlor." I have, again, I'm still reading Miss Hancock's letter to her mother. "I have 8 wall tents full of amputated men. The tents of the wounded I look right out on. It is a melancholy sight, but you have no idea how soon one gets used to it. Their screams of agony do not make as much impression on me now as reading this letter will upon you. You will think it is a short time for me to get used to things, but it seems to me as if all my past life was a myth, and as if I had been away from home 17 years. What I do here, one would think would kill at home, but I am well and comfortable. From my affectionate daughter, Cornelia Hancock." Well, although Cornelia was too young to qualify as a nurse under Army regulations, she was able to circumvent the rules by accompanying her brother-in-law, Dr. Henry Child, to Gettysburg in the aftermath of the 3-day battle. They served at a field hospital some 5 miles outside of Gettysburg, where she indicates there were hardly any tents in the first hours after the battle and no buildings to house the wounded. Formerly a school teacher, Cornelia had no training as a nurse. Her only qualification was a fervent desire to help. She was one of the rare women who lived and worked near the front lines. Most female nurses worked in general hospitals towards the rear or cities of the north. She served at Gettysburg and then at the Contraband Hospital in Washington City, the Army's winter camp at Brandy Station, and Belle Plain, Fredericksburg, White House Landing, and City Point more or less continually from July 1863 until May of 1865. So God bless her heart. August 8th, Union Private David Smith wrote to his wife about the fighting at Gettysburg, which had happened nearly a month earlier. "I hope that we shall never get into another fight like that at Gettysburg, for it was awful beyond description. I cannot describe it with my pencil, but I think you would not care to read the details of the fight as it was. I would just say I sat on my knees by the side of a stone fence and loaded and fired my gun until I had blisters on my fingers as big as 10-cent pieces from ramming down on the loads, and my gun was so hot I could not touch the barrel with my hands. And so was most of the other fellows. I never wanted to load and shoot so fast in all my life before. After the battle was over, some of our fellows went in among the dead to get their haversacks. They came back with short or long capes whichever you may call them, and some good biscuits. I tried to make some, but that was no use. So the captain told me I was about as hard-hearted as any of them. I had better go and get some, as there was plenty on the field. So I took my gun in one hand and my knife in the other, and I started on the hardest mission I have ever been on. The ground being nearly covered with the dead and wounded, the wounded crying for help and water, and well, they're crying they wanted to be killed, and so on, that I could not stand it. So I cut 2 haversacks off 2 dead men, picked up as many guns on the field as I could carry, and went back to the stone fence again. I got cakes and good fresh mutton, well cooked enough for 6 or 8 of us. The rebel sharpshooters were popping away at us all the time, but they did not hit me. And when we buried the dead, there was loads of long cakes lying around the battlefield. Now, I did pay a visit to General Sickles in a hospital in Washington City. This is after the battles there at Gettysburg. And General Sickles had lost a leg in the battles. The general asked me what I was doing at the time of the battles. I replied, well, I will tell you how it was in the pinch of the campaign up there when everybody seemed panic-stricken and nobody could tell what was going to happen. Oppressed by the gravity of our affairs, I went to my room one day and locked the door and got down on my knees before Almighty God. I prayed to Him mightily for victory at Gettysburg. I told Him that this war was His war, and our cause His cause. But we could not stand another Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville. And after that, I don't know how it was, and I cannot explain it, but soon a sweet comfort crept into my soul. The feeling came that God had taken the whole business into His own hands, and that things would go right at Gettysburg. That is why I had no fears about you. Well, the Soldiers' National Cemetery was established just before Gettysburg on the Cemetery Hill segment of the battlefield. Scottish horticulturist William Saunders was employed to design the cemetery. And a side note, Mr. Saunders also designed the Oak Ridge Cemetery just north of Springfield, Illinois. Well, Union soldiers' remains were transferred from the local church cemeteries from the field hospital burial sites and unburied soldiers who died to this cemetery hill. And placed with 3,564 total. Early November, I was invited by David Wills to attend the dedication ceremony of the National Cemetery. David Wills was a local attorney who organized the ceremony. He invited me to stay in his home, which was on the diamond, as they called the square there at Gettysburg. It was an afterthought that I presume that was an afterthought that I was invited, and they didn't really expect me to attend. When they received my acceptance as a courtesy, they asked me to say a few appropriate remarks with the emphasis on just a few. Mr. Edward Everett had been invited months before to be the principal speaker. He was a well-known orator and statesman who had served as president of Harvard, governor of Massachusetts, and ambassador to Great Britain. I understand that they had planned on this dedication ceremony earlier in October, but Mr. Everett said that he could not be ready by that time, so they did postpone it to November. Well, I did begin preparing my few remarks as I did all of my speeches. When something would come to me that would be appropriate for that speech, I would jot it down on a piece of paper and stick it in my hatband until it came time to put the notes together. I was quite busy with the nation's affairs and was glad that they just wanted a short speech, but I wanted it to be right for that occasion. Well, November the 18th, the day before the ceremony there at Gettysburg, was my friend, fellow attorney, and bodyguard Ward Hill Lamlin, my valet William Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and other dignitaries left Washington City for Gettysburg by train. I planned to work on my speech while traveling, but the tracks were so rough and the cars rocked so that it was not possible to write or to be able to read it afterwards anyway. We arrived about sundown at 6 o'clock and had dinner in the Wills home. After dinner, I went upstairs to my room, and quite a crowd gathered outside under my window, clamoring for me to speak. I finally responded with, in my position, it is sometimes important that I should not say foolish things, believing that it is my present condition this evening, the only way to help it is to say nothing at all. I must beg of you to excuse me from addressing you further. I did spend a couple of hours that evening revising the second page of my speech. I did hesitate about leaving Washington City. Our son, Taddy, was ill when we left Washington, and I was greatly relieved when I received word from Mary by the telegraph that Pat was feeling much better that evening. We had lost our son, Willie, a year and 9 months before that time. And our son, Eddie, we lost about 10 years before I became president. Well, November 19th, there were at least 15,000 people present for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, in which 3,564 soldiers were buried. After touring the village, I rode a small horse in the procession from the center of town to the cemetery, arriving at 11:15. The Honorable Everett had not yet arrived, and the bands played until he did arrive at 12 o'clock noon. On the platform sat state governors, army officers, foreign ministers, members of Congress, myself, and my party. Also on the platform was Georgia Wade McClellan, a sister of Jennie Wade. As I mentioned, Jennie was the only civilian killed while the battle was going on, and I especially invited Georgia to join us on the platform in honor of Jennie's sacrifice. Georgia was haunted for the rest of her life over the loss of Jennie. It was in her home that Jennie was killed by a stray bullet in the kitchen while making bread. Georgia had just given birth to a new baby. Just before the battle started, Georgia's husband was John Lewis McClellan, a carpenter. Well, Mr. Everett delivered a magnificent 2-hour address honoring those that were buried and the thousands that had fought here in a well-prepared and rehearsed speech which he had memorized. While suffering from a fever, I delivered a short speech, just 10 sentences and 210 words to the crowd, which were written on 2 sheets of paper. When the speech was complete, the audience very timidly applauded. As I returned to my seat, the photographer did not have enough time to have his camera set up to take an image of me speaking. Afterward, I called the speech a flat failure, an opinion echoed by several newspapers. Democratic newspapers described it as silly, flat, and dishwatery, although Republican newspapers said it was a perfect jam, deep in feeling, compact in thought and expression, tasteful and elegant in every word and comma. Mr. Everett wrote to me saying, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. I replied to him, in our respective parts, you could not have been excused to make a short address, nor I a long one. I'm pleased to know that in your judgment, the little I did say was not entirely a failure. Well, I'll let you folks decide for yourselves what you think of those few remarks. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or to detract. The world will no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Well, I suppose regarding receiving very little applause, I suppose the folks couldn't believe I was finished already. Or they just listened to a 2-hour address. Well, in my few words, I hope you recognize I covered the founding of our nation, events of previous decades, honoring the Union soldiers who had made the supreme sacrifice, looking to the future, and describing our government of the people, by the people, and for the people. You might be interested, I hand-penned 5 copies of the address. 1 each were for my secretaries, John Nicolay and Johnny Hayes. 1 was for Edward Everett, the featured speaker there that day. 1 for historian George Bancroft, and 1 for publisher Colonel Alexander Bliss. There are slight differences between the copies, with the Bliss copy being the standard version, which I just read. That evening after the ceremony, about 24 hours after we had arrived, our party took the train back to Washington. There on the platform, I was commencing to feel the chills go up and down my back and perspiration running down my body. And remember, this is November 19th, it was not a hot day. Here I was ill and suffered greatly on that train ride back to Washington City that evening. I thought we were never going to get there. My valet, William Johnson, did his best attending me to make me comfortable, with changing cold compresses on my head and so forth. Soon after we arrived home, the White House was quarantined, with me confined to bed much of the time with variola, a mild form of smallpox. I remarked, I finally have something I can give to everybody. Although, sad story, I was greatly saddened that my valet, William, became ill with the smallpox, which he no doubt caught from me, and he died the following January. William had traveled with us to Washington from Springfield back in February of 1861. I thought this was interesting, he was not accepted and was snubbed by the executive mansion employees who were of African descent, because William's skin was much darker than theirs. Well, William was then employed in the Secretary of Treasury, Sumner Chase's department, upon my recommendation. I did request that William accompany me on the trip to Gettysburg. Of course, I felt terrible about that, about him becoming ill. And after William's death, I had him buried in the Arlington Cemetery grounds, and I paid all the expenses for his funeral services, including his stone at the cemetery. Well, just some more items that I hope you'll find of interest. Going back 2 months before I was there in Gettysburg, this is in September of 1863, was Confederate General Benjamin Helms killed at the Battle of Chickamauga. And General Helm was married to Emily, Mary's little sister. And when Emily was 16 years, I believe, younger than Mary, and we kind of adopted her as our little sister. After her husband's death, Emily made her way through Union lines to Washington City, where she stayed in the White House with us, and tried to keep her visit we tried to keep her visit a secret. General Daniel Sickles somehow got word about it, and told me I should not have a rebel living in my house. I replied, General Sickles, my wife and I are in the habit of choosing our own guests. We do not need from our friends neither advice or assistance in the matter. Well, another special note, November the 26th was the first National Day of Thanksgiving and Praise in America. Going on the next day after the Thanksgiving, well, this is beginning November 27th to December 2nd, the little-known Battle of Mine Run, also known as Payne's Farm or New Hope Church, was conducted in Orange County, Virginia, considered as the great battle never fought, an unsuccessful attempt of the Union Army of the Potomac under General Meade to defeat the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under General Lee was marked by false starts and low casualties. General Meade was quite wise to call off the attack, which probably would have been a disaster for the Union Army, such as the Battle of Fredericksburg. And that was the end of hostilities at the Eastern Theater for that year. And going on, you might look at the pictures up here. December 2nd was when Thomas Crawford's 19-foot statue of freedom was placed on top of the recently completed United States Capitol building dome. When I first became president, I insisted that the dome be completed as a sign of faith that the country would get back together again. By the way, they had just recently been expanding the Capitol building. We had added states to the Union, and we needed more room for the senators and representatives. Well, this is my annual message at Congress, which was read. Of course, I was ill on December the 8th. This is what I wrote for that. During this year, we have renewed and gave our profoundest gratitude to God for another year of health and of sufficiently abundant harvests, efforts to stir up foreign wars and failed. Treaty between the United States and Great Britain for suppression of the slave trade was working. National banking law passed by Congress had proved a valuable support, and the troops were being paid punctually. The United States Navy was tightening its blockade of the enemy very successfully. Our post office took in nearly as much money as it had spent. Almost 1.5 million acres of land had been taken up by the new homestead law. The rebel borders were pressed still further back, and the Mississippi opened. Tennessee and Arkansas were cleared of insurgent control, and Maryland and Missouri are working on removing slavery within their limits. Former slaves, 100,000, were in the military service, with half of them bearing arms. I announced the proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, a full pardon with restoration of all rights of property to all rebels, excepting the highest-ranking Confederate officials who would have to take an oath of future loyalty to the United States Constitution and pledge to obey acts of Congress and presidential proclamations relating to slavery. The Southern states would be recognized when they reestablished governments supported by as few as 1/10 of their 1,860 voters who took the oath of allegiance. Well, I do thank you for your kind attention, and just a couple more. How are we on time? I guess we're not. Just another minute or so be okay? Well, it was December 14th, was when I pardoned my sister-in-law, Emily, and I announced the grant of amnesty for her. And it was December 17th, we're still in 1863, the Custis Lee Mansion and Estate, that was the home of General Robert Lee, became the property of the United States government for non-payment of back taxes. Taxes due were $92.07. And I think you know that became Arlington National Cemetery. And December 26th, I was pleased. The Philadelphia News and the Baltimore American announced their support for me in next year's presidential election. They are the first to do so. I do not expect to be reelected this next November. People are so tired of the war having gone on for almost 3 years at this time now. So we can only hope and pray that things will go on for this country. Well, I do thank you for your very kind attention, and again, thank you for your kind attention, and well, again, if you hadn't noticed it, things up here to take a look at, which you're welcome to do so, and anything else, I'd be glad to visit with you. So.